Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host Brian Keane, online fitness coach, nutritionist and 3-time best-selling author, here to help you by deconstructing expert guests on all things health, fitness and mindset. Today's guest is with health coach Becca Holland on hormone balancing strategies that help women lose weight permanently and how cortisol can ruin your progress. From the title, it sounds like it's going to be very female skewed, and to be honest, it is, but I did try and put a little bit of a counterbalance here. So if you're a male on a weight loss journey, or you're a coach and you're just interested in hormone balancing and some strategies that you can implement potentially with clients, then today's podcast is for you. Some of the things we talk about is the dieting and cortisol paradox. So when you're trying to drop your calories lower and lower and your cortisol is going higher and higher, and why you can weight loss plateau very easily, what to do if you're eating clean, feeling good, but you still aren't losing any weight, how to include more protein in your diet, why you shouldn't be afraid of fat, underrated tools for reducing cortisol, gut health, hormones and the link to weight loss, managing cravings, balancing hormones and not falling off track during your time of the month, and so much more. As I mentioned at the top, the podcast, it's very female orientated in terms of the skew, but I do think there's value here for men as well, as I try to do a little bit of a counterbalance as we go through. And if you are outside of Ireland, just a pre-warning, Rebecca talks very quickly, so you might need to slow the episode down. If you're Irish native or English native, you're probably going to be fine, but just a heads up on the front end. So without further ado, here's today's podcast episode with health coach Rebecca Holland on hormone balancing strategies that help women lose weight permanently and how cortisol can ruin your progress. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today with my guest, Rebecca Holland. Becca is a hormone balance health coach who specializes in helping women permanently lose weight through different hormone balancing strategies. Her 12-week Rebalance is a program for women who want to use hormone balancing strategies for permanent weight loss. I'm looking forward to talking all things cortisol, hormones, and long-term weight loss in today's show. Becca, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Brian. So excited to chat about this.
Oh, really excited. You're doing great work on Instagram in particular, Becca. And it popped up on my Reels or on my Explore page, a great post about cortisol, weight loss, and things that women need to know. And I got this light bulb moment. Oh my God, let's do a podcast around hormones, cortisol, weight loss, because it's not something we previously covered. But before we get into that, some of the misconceptions, some of the things that are holding women in particular back when it comes to losing weight, talk to us about your backstory and kind of what got you interested in health and wellness in the first place.
Yeah, so I suppose like everyone, the last kind of decade, I thought it was all about, calorie reduction and loads of exercise. Like my background, I've been a PE teacher like the last 10 years. And then I went off to the Netherlands and did a master's in health promotion. And the penny kind of dropped then. I was like, wow, there's a lot more to like weight loss and good health than just kind of the calorie counting and the exercise. And when the penny dropped and I saw the Dutch do it so well with hormone balance, then I began to say, oh, this is the area that needs to be pushed forward, because like so much women are struggling, and every client I have now is so transfixed on the nutrition side and they're missing out on a trick with all the other elements. So like for me, it really hit me in 2020. I have now, they're nearly 3, my twins, but when I first had them, it was lockdown and I was like, I've never experienced stress like it, like most people. And I had really elevated cortisol at that time. And I realized like I was kind of developing this belly I never had before. I was really out of control with my food because my stress levels were so high. I was like craving salt and sugar. And it hit me so hard then. If I wasn't optimizing everything around the nutrition wasn't going to work. And I think that's where most people the women, they focus on their nutrition, but they don't have a strategy to let the nutrition go free flow well, so that was like the penny drop moment for me. And it scared me a little bit, because I thought, wow, there's a lot of people out there that don't know what I know from clients or masters, whatever. But that was for me like, oh shit, people are not getting this and they're banging their head against the wall with nutrition, and it shouldn't be like this.
What's the biggest mistake you think people make when it comes to nutrition? Because you mentioned there about caloric restriction, which is what I love about your content, is it funnels all the way around. You talk about sleep and stress and recipes and nutrient-dense foods, but also hormonal imbalance and making this all factor into your lifestyle so that people can stick to it. You're a mum with twins. Like, you know what it's like to be short on time, to have stressful moments and to be able to manage that. But when it comes to the nutrition element, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is from personal experience where, and again, I'm a big believer, obviously calories are important. They're the principle of energy in, energy out. But hormones play a massive role, particularly with females, more so even than males, but to males to a degree as well. What are some of the biggest mistakes you tend to see your clients making, people following you who are struggling and frustrated? What's some of the biggest nutritional mistakes they make?
I think a really big one for women is focusing on kind of getting lost with the calorie counting. And like, it's so important to be aware of the calories. And for a short term, it's a great nutritional strategy to be aware of the calories. But once you get lost in the calories and you go away from the nutrient density of food, that's where people become unstuck, because your hormones react differently to all the foods you eat. So if you're just looking at keeping the calories low, you're not getting enough good fats, you're not getting enough good quality protein. I think that's exactly where most women kind of go off track. And then it becomes like this really confusing concept. Why am I not losing weight? I'm eating low calories. But your body's like, oh my God, I want all this sugar, I want all this salt, because you're not giving it what it needs. So I think like that in itself is one of the biggest traps. And people come to me and say, oh, you don't have the calories in your nutrition strategy handbook or your recipe ebook. I'm like, I purposely don't, because I want you to learn about the nutrient density of food. And I think like that's why clients are able to lose weight sustainably, because they're like, okay, the calories is one thing, but I need to understand food as well.
Yeah, I think something that I've said on this podcast is calorie tracking is a skill that you use when you need it. It's kind of like learning to fire an arrow or a bow. Like, so you don't need to use calorie tracking all the time, but being mindful of calorie amounts in foods can be helpful. But that's one element of it, the nutrient density. It's funny, I was in Subway the last day. I wasn't having a Subway because it's not my food of choice, but I was in Subway for Holly's, my daughter's birthday. And her mum was there, her sister, her auntie, etc. And they were like, oh, there's only so and so amount of calories in this food, you should eat it. And I'm like, I don't look at the calories in food, I look at the nutrient density of the food. That's literally how I choose. And actually, I think Subway is miles ahead of, McDonald's and Supermax and some of the other alternatives. And that's an important element that people forget. As you said, they jump straight into calories. And that ties me on to something I was going to talk about later, but I'm going to bring it on to now, because you did a reel, I'm not sure how long ago it was, I'd say a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago by the time this goes out, dieting and cortisol, and how excessive dieting or people that are dieting can have elevated cortisol, and as a result they are doing quote unquote what they think is the right thing, but they're actually making themselves more stressed, and cortisol is elevated and actually not getting the result they want. Talk to us about dieting and cortisol and that little bit of a paradox between the two.
Yeah, well, that's a really, really one that hits home for me, because when I turned 23, I finished kind of my physical education training in UL in Limerick, and I had put on loads of weight in college, like binge drinking, just eating crap, not exercising much. And I moved to Dubai to PE teach. And I remember within like 3 to 4 months, I'd lost over 2 stone with like major caloric restriction plus a huge amount of overexercise. I do a lot of very high intensity exercise anyway, but I was at a point then, my body was under so much stress. My sleep became impacted. My sugar cravings were through the roof. And I realized at that point, my cortisol was so elevated that other hormones, and cortisol is the hormone that will knock off loads of other hormones. It's like a domino effect. Once that is elevated, then you affect your testosterone, your progesterone, your estrogen. And I noticed at that time, I had this extremely bad acne I had in my chin, which is hormonal, that I never had before. I actually was losing hair. My skin was dry. I had like very low libido. My sleep was terrible. And I didn't actually realize at the time, it's in hindsight, like hindsight's 2020, that it was because I had elevated my cortisol so much through such stress in my body from the restriction of calories and not enough nutrient dense food, that I was in this total mess that I now realize loads of people come to me with, and it's more common than we think. So that's the thing. Your body, we're not made to be constantly going and constantly kind of depriving ourselves, and that is going to put your body into fight or flight response. And once you're in fight or flight response as well, that's very connected then to insulin resistance, which so many people, I suppose even in Ireland, like in the US, it's I suppose more than 50% they say have some degree of insulin resistance. Even here, when your cortisol goes high, that initiates us to release glucose because your body wants to run away, like it's fight or flight. And then we have this like horrible situation with insulin having to produce more, and then your blood sugars are crashing, and you're in this cycle of like craving sugar, energy's dropping. And I think that's like way more common for women and men than we kind of realize. And that's why now as well a big focus is the insulin resistance side of things, because it's so connected to hormone balance and the elevated cortisol.
Yeah, there's a book, one of my favorites that I come back to every couple of years, by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, on why zebras don't get ulcers. And it's a bread and butter scientific approach to cortisol stress in the body. And I absolutely love it because similar to you, because I was a teacher, primary school teacher for 4 years. And I remember during my observations before I qualified as a teacher that I wouldn't be able to eat for maybe half a day until my observation, just pure stress and cortisol. And then after, you would get this like cortisol dump and you could eat people out of house and home because you just wanted so many sugars and carbs. And understanding what's happening from a physiological standpoint kind of arms you with, oh, this is what's going on. I can put better strategies in place, or I can choose to override it knowing that it will pass. And with that, I'm very curious, because cortisol obviously being the stress hormone that works as a domino effect, like you said there, Becca. When people balance out their cortisol, or let me rephrase, because I think this is an important one for people to understand, people who are controlling for calories, who are trying to lose weight, but have an excessive amount of cortisol, people sometimes forget that you won't respond and you're actually going to hit a plateau way faster, even if you keep reducing calories, partly because of that dieting and cortisol paradox that you mentioned. What's your approach when that happens to somebody? Because, you know, some people will come in and think, well, if I just keep cutting calories, that's where people go to, you know, the man with the hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. They think, well, I'll just keep cutting calories, when in fact they need to address their cortisol. What's your first step or 0 to 1 process with somebody in that situation?
Yeah, so it's funny. I suppose that's like kind of bread and butter of what I'm doing now, especially the first 6 weeks when I'm working with someone, because we're actually hammering down the circadian rhythm side of things and the stress management side of things over the nutrition. Like, the nutrition will come, but how can you implement a good nutrition strategy if you're in that state of stress? You won't adhere to it anyway, because your body's going to be so dying to get more salt and sugar that you're just not going to be able to stick to it. So, like, first of all, you're hammering down your circadian rhythm. And for me, that is so neglected. And
explain that for people, for anyone that's unfamiliar with the terminology.
So circadian rhythm basically is your body's cells and your body's clock. So if you don't have circadian rhythm in place, which means you don't have a regular bedtime, you don't have regular meal times, you're not controlling your temperature before bed or in bed, that means that your whole body's dysregulated. And that means also you're dysregulating hunger. So often when we've like poor sleep cycle, and I focus on sleep optimization the most because that's a big part we can control through more light during the day, like more morning light, for example, 10 minutes in the sun, 20 minutes overcast day, 30 minutes for kind of a very overcast day. So basically 30 minutes in Ireland, and just trying to get ways to get more of that light in the morning so that we can produce the melatonin that night. And that's the key. And most of us are inside so much that our sleep is really poor. And that compounded with irregular meal times, too close to bed, for example, and then you don't have a sleep space that's actually like conducive to good sleep. Like, your sleep hygiene isn't good. You're scrolling in bed. The blue light affected circadian rhythm, and it's all these things we would do. Especially, like, I suppose anyone now with a phone is scrolling in bed. That disrupts your circadian rhythm. And it's all these things like doing the basics right, getting your morning light, stop scrolling in bed, have like a wind down routine to help with stress management. So when you team that kind of circadian rhythm plan, which would be your morning light, meal timings, good sleep routine, good morning routine, with a really good stress management strategy, then your body starts to relax, brings down cortisol. And obviously, if there's more elements to the reasons behind the high cortisol, it's important to address them. Obviously, the root cause of the high cortisol, like, it could be the root cause of your high cortisol could be, you know, really bad relationship, or the obvious ones like jobs and stuff. But also you could have elevated cortisol from your body, like your physical body been stressed. So the over exercise, not getting the proper nutrition, you know, so there's two ways to look at the high cortisol, and it could be a mix of both, which it usually is.
Yeah, that's great advice in terms of how to look at it, because cortisol, and I tell people it's cumulative. It doesn't matter where it's coming from, whether it's from relationships, from a stressful day at work, or training. You can only handle so much. And something that people that aren't into, say, endurance or excessive training, like CrossFitters, etc., you have to control for stress in your everyday life. Otherwise, you can't push it that hard in those sessions, or things break down. You get sick, your immune system or your sex drive drops off, or your energy levels plummet. And it's very important to manage that. With calories then and cortisol, something that I'm very curious of in terms of your professional approach, Becca, because like as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, I love the way you approach things, that sleep optimization, reducing cortisol, taking the hormones, balancing them out, looking at nutrition. You put up great recipes on Instagram, so it's giving people a very holistic view. But from your professional experience, if you have somebody that comes to you that's looking to lose weight, and then you put them on a calorie nutrient dense plan, meaning there's no calories controlled, but it's just nutrient dense foods, and they're still not losing weight, what tends to be your next professional step with them?
So I think a major part of the nutrition strategy that I go with is educating people around calorie density as opposed to calorie restriction, so they understand how to make a nutrient dense meal that's not as calorie dense. And I think that alone is a skill, and it's not a skill that most people understand. And exactly what you said, when you're in Subway, like you're looking at the nutrient density and you're looking at the calorie density. So calorie density, for example, if you look at a plate of salad versus a plate of chocolate, the plate of chocolate is obviously more calorie dense. So you're trying to find as many nutrient dense foods on the plate, but not make it too calorie rich. So that's like the major thing, because more often than not, if you hit the nutrients right, you have a decent amount of fat. And fat for me is a really important one. Like I could talk all day about the importance of having your extra virgin olive oil, your avocado, nuts, seeds, and that in each meal for the blood sugar balance aspect, because that's going to completely control your hunger to a degree. And that's why, for example, Slimming World and all the rest of it won't work, because if we don't have adequate fat for hormone production, then you're in a whole load of hormonal chaos. And I experienced that for all them years. My fat intake was so low because I thought that's a good thing. Like historically in the 80s, 90s, even recently, people say, lower your fat. But you're actually shooting yourself in the foot. You're literally shooting yourself in the foot, because your sugar and salt cravings will be through the roof. Like we need more fat. And that's why I'd really hammer that in the morning, like have your really good source of fat, which most people don't. They have their bowl of porridge with a bit of honey through it if they're lucky, right? And that for me is okay, it's better than having a bar of chocolate in the morning. But when you have that quick source of energy and you don't have the fat to help it be blood sugar balancing and make you less hungry for longer, then you run into problems. And I think that's the problem with majority of women I see come to me. There's such a lack of fat in each of their meals, then their evening hunger is out of control. And like that's the key for me. You have your good source of fat and protein, especially in your morning meal, but throughout the day. And that's what really makes the nutrition strategy like doable.
Yeah, and it's sustainability and permanent weight loss,
100%.
which is your focus, and that's what does it. And something I've told people in the past is Slimming World works, but it doesn't work long term. The same way as a shot of cocaine will help for happiness, but it's not going to support you long term.
Yeah,
like when you think Slimming World works, I'm like, think of cocaine for happiness. Like it'll temporarily work, but over the long term, it's probably not the best idea.
Yeah.
With fat, then, Becca, do you find that some of the women you work with are still afraid of fat based on miseducation or misinformation? And if so, how do you re-educate them onto incorporating it into their diet? It's
actually crazy, because the majority of people, when we talk about the fat, they're actually, like you say, scared of including it. Like literally the societal association with including fat in women's meals is insane. And I completely understand, because genuinely until a few years ago, I was the exact same. So now I'm like trying to show more than anything the long-term look at it, right? If you look today, you're going to eat fat in each of your 3 meals, right? That's going to mean you're going to eat less calories this evening because you're going to be more satisfied. It means, we'll say, for example, the week before your period, when you understand you need a little bit more glucose that week, for example, you include a little bit more complex carbs and you team that with fat and protein, then you're onto a winner, because you're now not craving all the extra calories you'd normally crave. So it actually saves you. And that's the way I look at it with clients. You're saving yourself overeating unnecessary calories by eating the fat. And I think that kind of clicks for some people, because they're like, okay, I get it. If I eat this now, I'm not going to eat double the amount of calories tonight.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful for people. And the same approach is something I apply when someone's got a disordered eating pattern of skipping meals. I had one of my girls who would literally be like, well, I'm not hungry until, 4 o'clock in the day, and then would literally eat 2,000 calories above her maintenance every single day because she was starving. And then regular meal timings, like you said, it was focusing on that process, and there was caloric restriction built into that nearly by accident, because you were controlling with regular meals. And something else people fall down on is protein in meals. We've talked about fat, we know carbohydrates in terms of blood sugar. Do you find that some of the women you work with, or definitely some who follow you, you have a big presence online, particularly on social media through Instagram, but do you find protein is something some of your women in particular struggle with?
Yeah, it is, because I suppose it's such a buzzword at the moment, and everyone's like horsing into them Aldi protein yogurts and their protein bars and their protein powders. And that's all well and good. Like, it's a means to an end. You can get extra protein. But when you start to rely on them sources of protein that aren't overly digestible, that's kind of a tricky situation, because really, like, now, especially with clients that are really making strides with nutrition, they're including 2 to 3 sources of protein in each meal. So, for example, their dinner, they're looking at a lean meat, they're looking at beans and lentils, for example, or maybe eggs. So they have like 2 to 4 sources of protein in each meal that are good quality sources they can digest well. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, because they think, oh, I have one source of protein, tick. And then it mightn't be a good source, it mightn't be digested well. So I think that's a good way of looking at it, when you kind of say to yourself, like, when you're doing your meal prep every week, and like, I suppose a lot of clients, their meal prep is so good because they factor in that they need like 5 sources of protein pre-made, and then when they're making the meal, they can take like 2 to 3 of them sources of protein out of their meal prep boxes, and there you go, you've like a really good start to the plate.
Yeah, as you mentioned, that whole food version as 80% of your nutrition, and again, your protein yogurts, your protein bars, your protein shakes, all really good and serve different purposes, but your main meals, breakfast, lunch and dinner, should always have a whole food for variation in there. I think, again, you can't go wrong with that nutrient density and that approach. With females in particular then, and obviously time of the month cycles are going to be a big thing here in terms of hormonal balance. What do you think women need to consider when it comes to how they either eat, how they train, how they live in the lead up to their cycle? Now, I know this is a bit of a Pandora's box because everyone's body is so different, but as a general rule, for those who are struggling with hormones, particularly around the time of the month, what are some of the approaches you take?
This one's a tricky one because there's not a whole lot of research in it, right? But anecdotal research and looking at clients, and there's a huge movement now towards cycle syncing, which really just is a framework, right? Where you start to track your cycle. So it's just creating awareness. You're creating the awareness of, okay, I know my hormones are low the day my period starts. For the next kind of 10 days, it's the follicular phase, you know? So the follicular phase will be the 2 weeks before ovulation, and your luteal phase is the 2 weeks after ovulation. But understanding that the week before your period, that's the second half, the luteal phase, that's really where a lot of people overeat, because your body needs more glucose to produce progesterone, which is like our calming hormone, our hormone, you know, that allows us to become pregnant. And when we kind of undereat and restrict too much that week, and we try and eat like the rest of the month, that's where we start to really crave a lot of sugary foods, because your body needs that extra glucose for the progesterone production. So if you're clever about it, and my clients now, they pretty much reduce and eliminate cravings that week, because they start to factor in a little bit more complex carb that week and kind of 10 to 20% more calories that week. And if you're clever about it like that, Jesus Christ, like, you've made the month so much easier for yourself, because you're not beating yourself up mentally as well. It's very important. You're able to stay on track because you're like, oh, I've just given my body what it needs, that little bit extra complex carb. I'm keeping going with my fat and protein. And like, it's amazing just by that shift alone that week, how much less unnecessary calories you're going to eat, right? But then if you understand in the follicular phase that your body wants like lighter meals, that's the time you can do your little bit of a calorie deficit much more sustainably. Then you understand, wow, okay, it's ovulation. I'm bang in the middle of my cycle. That's when my energy is really high for most people. That's when I can hammer my endurance, hammer my high intensity. And kind of, if you look at like the seasons, I love to look at it this way, it makes it so easy. The first day of your period, that's when like your winter starts. You want to hibernate. You want to do more of your low intensity activity, like stuff you want to do at winter, like, and just kind of eating more of the warming foods as well. Your body wants that, wants to be nourished. Then you're kind of moving into the spring when your period ends up until ovulation. So that week you're looking more at like spring foods, salads, more lean meats, and your training intensity is getting higher because your energy is rising, because hormones are rising. And then you get to ovulation. That's like your summer. That's the peak. That's when all your hormones are like high. You're in great form. Your training intensity is amazing. And then the first week of your luteal phase, that's kind of like your autumn. And then it's kind of a wind down. You're winding down your training to an extent, like To be very honest, I would train fairly hard the majority of the month, but I try and do my mobility kind of the week before my period, more of my mobility, more of my slower runs, less intense stuff. But if you're just looking at it like from someone that's not really into their training, it's a really nice framework to follow, because that week before your period, then you're kind of winding down, you do more your yoga, Pilates. And if you are in a running program, for example, you're using that for your like slower runs. So I think like the whole framework, it just leads to so much less physical exhaustion, and you hammer your workouts and you enjoy them so much better because you fueled your body for them. Like you're ready for them.
Yeah, and I think even the research that's coming out now, it gives so much education around how to intuitively eat, how to intuitively train around your cycle, because Dr. Stacey Sims has been on the podcast a few times, and she's got a great quote that women are not small men, and that you can't take the exact approach that works for a man and expect to get optimal performance for a female. Was something I wanted to double back on, just because I know you lost your period for most of your 20s because you had that chronic undereating, over-exercising and an unhealthy relationship with food during the time. How did you get out of that, Becca, in terms of the 0 to 1, the initial stages, in terms of, because chronic overeating, over-exercising, those two things come very closely tied together with a lot of people from my experience. Some I've worked with, some I've just spoken to, in conversation. But for you to redevelop that healthy relationship with food, and now obviously re-educating and educating people on your mediums and how to do that, what was your 0 to 1 step on that? How did you get back to that healthy relationship with food?
Yeah, I think the very first thing for me was, yes, it coincided with becoming pregnant, right? But that aside, even if I didn't, it was a point I could no longer continue what I was doing, because even the transition from my late 20s to early 30s, my calories that my body needed were gone so low that unless I was able to push them up, which I did gradually, that was kind of my first step to realizing, right, I'm only my early 30s. I can't continuously do this. My energy's crap. I know something's going to give. I know health-wise, like it's not going to continue going. So that was the first thing for me, to understand that I could actually raise my calories very slowly and gradually, so that I got them up to a little bit higher amount that was giving me a bit more energy. I was able to train better. I was feeling better. So that kind of idea that you can actually do that without probably put on like 2 to 3 pounds over kind of 2 to 3 months, and that's what it took for me to kind of slowly get my period back and kind of understand that I can actually eat like a normal amount on a day-to-day basis without gaining weight, because I was living in fear for like 10 years that if I went over this, like it probably was, I didn't calorie count, but it probably was like in the region of 1,200 to 1,300 calories per day, and I'm 6 foot tall. So I mean, like I was living on so little compared to what I need, and I was doing 2 hours of really intense exercise, probably 2 to 3 hours a day for 6 days a week. So like something had to give. And I think that was the thing I'd say to any woman that's saying, right, I'm at this point now where and loads of people message me and say this, they say, how am I going to increase my calories? Like I'm gone to such a low point that now if I even like look at a bar of chocolate, as they say, I'm going to put on weight. So like it's knowing that you just have to be patient and gradually, slowly increase your amount of nutrient dense food every day. And that's what I'd be looking at.
What was your process in terms of time period? Because obviously when you're at this point, and I've had similar conversations kind of mirrored based on what you've said, that that's the exact terminology. If I look at a chocolate bar or if I look at a piece of cake, I go up 2 pounds or I go up 3 pounds, partly because calories have been decreased so low that they have nowhere to go anymore. Mm-hmm. What was the time period for you in terms of how you nearly cycled out, in terms of you went from lower calories to increasing more nutrient dense food? Was it over weeks, over months, over years? What was the time period, Becca?
Yeah, so it was probably only around the 6-month period that it took to actually bring them up. Like when I kind of think back, it kind of just gradually happened out of necessity, because I just needed the energy, because I was breastfeeding my twins. Like I just had to do it. I had no choice. But then I mentally as well was coming to terms with it too. But probably I'd say 6 months to gradually, incrementally bring them up without seeing much of weight gain. So that was important for me, because I still at that point wasn't at the point where I was okay with putting on the weight I needed to put on, So that took time. And that's why I think it took them 6 months, because mentally I was catching up with what I was doing physically.
just to give people an idea that obviously everyone's journey is going to be different, but sometimes when people hear that, they think, oh, okay, I'll do this over the next 3 weeks now and I'll be fixed, whereas you probably need a longer runway of time. General rule of thumb I found is the longer you've been doing that extreme under eating, excessive exercise, the longer it takes to come back out of it. So and just to set the expectations for people. When it comes to cortisol then, Becca, that was obviously something that was very elevated in you from that under eating, that excessive exercise. But when it comes to cortisol and what you know now and all the education you provide to people you're working with, people online, what's something that you wish you knew about either stress or cortisol that you know now that would have helped you massively back then?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that you can't, the last time and I suppose the time you're definitely not going to follow a stress management plan is when you're stressed. So like that's the main thing. When you say, oh, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to journal, like you're not going to do any of that shit when you're stressed. Literally none. So like for me, it's like you need literally black and white in front of you. You need like your acute stress plan and your daily stress plan. So that includes like your morning routine, your evening routines. And I literally have them written out, like stick them on your wall if you need to until they become habitual. But for me, it took literally months, right, of writing down 9 o'clock, 10 rounds of deep breathing, 12 o'clock, I eat mindfully. 5 o'clock, I do some box breathing for like 2 minutes, like my time's limited. I have a really good evening routine, and it took me months to actually do my evening routine because I kept sneaking the phone into the room and be like, oh, I'll just work a little bit more. I'll go on the phone a little bit more. So when that hit, right, and I started to realize, wow, my sleep's unreal when I started doing the stress management, because my sleep was gone to bits when I wasn't doing the stress management plan. But right, written plan. Then when you have your acute stress plan, that's just a few extras added on to really regulate the nervous system. Because like now I listen to binaural beats, delta waves at nighttime. That helps me relax my body, as does the deep breathing, as does reading instead of scrolling. So like you're finding all these combinations, like my stress management plan wouldn't work for you and vice versa. You have to find this combination that works for you, that fits into your lifestyle. Like I'm not going to get up at 4 and do this like 20-step morning routine. It's not happening. Like I need something that's like 10 minutes, So it's like finding the perfect, I suppose, strategy for you. And once I clicked with the stress management and the importance of it, because I just thought it was for people that were like really stressed, like really bad anxiety. But when I realized it's for everyone, like because we're living in a society that creates a lot of stress that we wouldn't have had, we'll say 100 years ago. So once I realized like that's a necessary part of health, that stress management plan, that written stress management plan, that's when things became so easy. My nutrition became so easy. I was no longer having these crazy sugar cravings. Like everything became just, I could be a bit more present. And then they all are like this, I suppose, circle that when you hit the stress management right, and that's what I hammer the most, to be honest, out of every pillar in terms of nutrition, it's and mindset and all that. But for me, it's the stress management and the sleep. They are what are going to allow you to balance your hormones effectively. What's
the biggest underrated stress management tool that you use?
Oh, okay. That's a good one. I really like this one, right? So the long inhale, your sharp inhale, and then your longer exhale. And that for me is like straight away I feel it. Like I literally felt it there. If you do 10 rounds of that takes what, like 1 to 2 minutes, and your whole body's like that, physically relaxed. And like sometimes you can't think your way out of stress. You have to physically get out of the stress. And that for me is like my go-to.
I love that. I think breathing is such an underrated tool.
Oh, it's like that, along with a bit of cold exposure and a few other things, like can be so effective. But even if you're just thinking small and you just want to start right now today, I'd be saying, like, say to yourself, I'm going to do kind of throughout the day 3 or even 10 rounds of that inhale exhale, like in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening. And like that's transformational.
Yeah, it's the small, seemingly insignificant things added up over time that have a massive effect. What about gut health then? Because I know this is something you cover, and thankfully when you eat nutrient-dense food, it largely looks after itself, assuming there's no underlying condition or issue. And this is the kind of one that I have gotten a problem with, because I have a history of gut issues. It's something I have to really manage, and my stress, they're connected. I have irritable bowel syndrome, and they're very heavily linked. If I'm stressing out psychologically or eat food that doesn't agree with me, it has this kind of spiral domino effect, like you said, not hormones for me, but cravings and energy and mood and all these things get triggered off. How important is gut health when it comes to stress management in particular, and some of the food choices that people make? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I'm actually reading Tim Spector's book, The Diet Myth, at the moment. And it's interesting because he has all them twin studies. And it's just really interesting because exactly what you say, we can do all the eating of your pre and probiotics. You can be making your sauerkraut at home. You can be eating your kefir. You can be having this nutrient dense diet with seeds, nuts. And I do recommend all these things and a huge amount of diversity and variety. But if you can't manage the stress, that inflammation is really going to go against you, and everything you're doing well with nutrition isn't going to be as effective, so it's just so important that you marry the two together. And like the biggest thing as well is like, what is causing inflammation in your body specifically? And that's why it's hard when you look at short form content on social media, because people are throwing out like, all your kombucha and eat this food and eat that food. But actually you need to find out, and more than anyone, you need to find out what works for you. Like, what is specifically going to work for you. And that takes time, and people don't want to put the time into it. But believe me, like the gut health, even if your goal is hormone balance or weight loss or whatever it is, your gut health is centered to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had Tim on the podcast too. A very interesting conversation we had, because his whole philosophy is that if you look after your gut, everything else looks after itself. And to a large extent, that's true. Obviously, context matters massively, whether it's weight loss or someone with a physical performance goal, etc. But it plays such an important role to that. If you don't fix that, you're basically trying to run a marathon with a 20 kilo vest on your back. Same as if your hormones aren't balanced, you probably can get some of your weight off and lose some body fat, but it's like trying to run a marathon with that 20 kilo vest. It'd be just a lot easier if you took it off and went to run it. It's not easy anyway, but it would just be easier with weight loss in particular then, Becca. And you can use either your own experience or those of clients, but what's the biggest mistake you see people make? And I think I've seen them all at this stage over the last few years, and as you mentioned there, finding what works for you. And this is where I really struggle with short form content on social media. I've said this to you before, that social media is something I hate. Social media in terms of consumption, I feel like it's the junk food of education. It's like eating McDonald's and Supermax, going on to Instagram or TikTok. Although I'm on it and I create content for it, I like podcasts, I like books, but it's the junk food equivalent, because you're getting snippets of things without all the context. And I think people can jump on things very quickly, I think, which leads to misconceptions and leads to frustration. But some of the mistakes you see, either the biggest ones you made yourself or that clients make, what comes to mind when I say that?
Yeah, so when you say that about social media, it's like, it's such a killer because there's so much good information on it, but when it's always out of context, and that's why it's really hard for women to see these before and after pictures of 12 weeks transformations, because they're thinking, wow, I should be able to lose, 20 kg in 12 weeks. What's wrong with me? And I think, first of all, the mindset side of things, that's tricky. The other side of it is like, now it's what I eat in a day is so impactful for people. Like everyone says, I want to see what people eat in a day. But as we know, that's only effective for that, possibly that person. And it might need to be a true representation of what they eat on a day-to-day basis. So I think in terms of, it's the mindset that people come to me with that really is like the first thing you need to tackle, because they're used to seeing quick results. And like that is, as you know, for me, quick results mean you quickly regain the weight. And it's like getting, especially women, to think slow and steady wins the race, but they're like, oh my God, I have a wedding in a month, I need to drop a lot of weight. And it's like trying to manage that expectation is so important. So yeah, I think, that's a major one. That really is a major one. The rush. It's a rush. It's a huge rush. Like even in the first 6 weeks, I have clients that lose I'll talk to you about one, right? She has lost 6 pounds in the last 6 weeks, right? And the other day she was like, I know this is good, but I feel really disappointed. And I was like, oh my God, like this is the perfect example of how women want to be doing it so fast, but it's not because we're made to do that. It's just because social media has made us think that that's what's normal.
That was going to be my next follow. Well, you've given me a nice follow on, because my next question was going to be where you think that's coming from. But how do you think people, inoculate is the word that comes to mind, but how do you think people don't succumb to that or don't fall for that? Obviously get off social media, but there's also great people like you, Becca, putting out great content to educate people. It's short form, and then you can go long form on podcasts, etc. And there is definitely a way to use social media to enhance your knowledge and educate yourself. But for those women, and this falls for both genders to be honest, that want everything yesterday, what do you think is the approach when it comes to social media that they should take? Is it minimize who they're following? Is it coming off the platforms completely? What do you think people should do?
Oh yeah. Oh no. Like I've completely changed my algorithm the last 6 months, right? I am literally getting rid of anyone that I kind of made me have that, like, comparison is the thief of joy comes to mind. Once that person was triggering that in me, gone, unfollow. And now my algorithm is just like people that are research backed, people that are themselves. And it's like, for me, if you look at my, when you scroll my Instagram, it's a very healthy thing to look at, because the people I'm following are real and they're giving out really good science backed information. So like when I follow the likes of you, it's like that doesn't give me anxiety. It gives me good information. I'm enjoying the content. Like then it's such a positive thing then. That's why when people say I'm coming off social media, I'd say, okay, rethink that. Can you just unfollow and change your algorithm? You know, and that's the most important thing for me, because I have actually learned so much, especially on TikTok, from like people that like really interpret evidence well. And I think that's a huge thing for me, the misinterpretation of studies. And then you have this like shitstorm of all this random information that's like pulled together, and like you have to put your glasses on, right? Because if you can't read a study and interpret a study, and just because a doctor is saying it's right doesn't mean it's right. Like you need to understand that interpretation and understand like the conclusion of a study can be biased in so many ways. So for example, look what happened in the 80s. All fat's bad. You know, and that's like a huge part of it for me, is like when I look at a study, like the other day I went down a rabbit hole about soy, and oh my God, did I find every kind of bit of evidence to suit who made the study. And I was actually, after I was probably deep in 10 papers, and by the end of it I still had actually no conclusion. Like, so you just need to be so careful about, I suppose, that element of things.
What's your personal filtering process then? Do you, when you see something online, and again, I don't want to go too far away because the average person isn't going to dissect PubMed and different research papers, etc. But let me rephrase the question so it actually provides a little bit more value to people, because it might kind of piggyback off what I'm about to ask. For people who want to learn more and they find a study or a claim somewhere and they're either confused by it, first thing you need to do is a critical eye, meaning that you don't take it at face value because you have to go further. What is the next step for somebody? Do you think they should reach out and ask, if it's someone that's working with you, ask their coach and filter it back and see how it gets filtered through you, or message on DM, or follow up with the studies themselves? What would you recommend for those people? Because I have my own kind of 2 cents on it in terms of how people, like, I think you take everything with a critical eye, everything with a pinch of salt, because every study, and nearly every study, particularly with nutrition, oh my God, with nutrition, you can argue either side depending on where you cherry pick the evidence from. And as our jobs as coaches, it's to educate ourselves so that we can apply the context for individuals. But for someone that's listening to this podcast, because they're quite, people that listen to this podcast, we have about a 60-40 female to male split, but they're people who educate themselves and they're interested in nutrition, they're interested in health, they're interested in wellness. For those who see something online and they think, oh, that's interesting with cortisol or progesterone or soy or dairy, etc., what would you say is the next step for them to see if it applies to them? Would you say just anecdotally apply it and try, follow on evidence and see if there's more information they need to acquire, or what would you recommend there?
Yeah, it's tricky, because what's coming to mind is somebody I work with that has hypothyroidism, and she was confused about eating soy because the interaction with L-thyroxine, the thyroid medication. And like, she's working with me, so she asked me, I go do the research, you know. But what if you're not working with someone? What do? You know? So you look at the study and you think, are the cohort or the people in this study, are they similar to me? Like, are they female? Are they in their 40s like her? Or is it like all males that are in their 20s? So it's really important to have this critical eye. And it's very easy to do that. You just look at the, even the abstract, and just be like, right, so are these people comparable to me? Is there enough people in this study to actually make it worthwhile? Like, and then that alone is going to give you more insight. Them 2 factors, the amount of people and are they like me? I think that gives like a kind of a snapshot into it. But like, ideally you're asking the source. You're going to the person that's giving out that information. You're able to ask them the questions like, is this applicable to me? Is this source credible, kind of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Tim Spector earlier, because one of the things he said he regretted doing on his podcast was he was one of the early researchers about how caffeine can I can't remember now, was it either cause cancer or increase longevity in lifespan? It was one of the extremes, and he said he was embarrassed to admit it now because at the time it helped get his name out there, and he looks back now and goes, that was actually really harmful information because it didn't apply the context. And I think you have to think about studies like that online. I just have one final thing, Becca, that I want to ask, because it touches a little bit on what you meant on social media, or what you touched on with social media. Obviously curating your feed is a big thing when it comes to education and making it a more positive place because there's a lot of toxicity online. But when it comes to social media, over the last few months, you've blown up, particularly on Instagram. I know you're very active on TikTok and other platforms as well. Why do you think, from your own view, that your content is connecting so much with people? And again, I have my view, and again, I think you're doing great work, but just curious from your perspective, because you're obviously working with a lot of people that are coming through the program, that are following you online, etc. Why do you think it's connecting so much?
Okay, I'll be very honest, right? Initially, when I started making content, I literally could not be arsed putting on makeup every day and actually bothering with a script. I literally was like, I don't have time for this. I have to collect my kids from the creche. So by default, it just became raw. And I think people much prefer a raw version of you rather than like the Instagram hun. So I found like that for me, I did at the time, I was nearly embarrassed going on with like, I just looking disheveled. But then after a while, I was like, you know what? I actually don't care. And the information I'm giving is providing value. And if you provide enough value to an audience, you will blow up. Like if you provide that and you're in DMs, you're talking to people and you're genuine, it's been genuine and raw, not all the other stuff like the aesthetic stuff that people actually want you, you know, like want the real version of you. And I think that's the crux of it. No more than yourself, like people know you. I feel like I know you before this podcast because I've been listening to this podcast for years. I've been looking at your content, your stories, and you're yourself. You know that. Like, you know yourself. So like people will come up to you, like I'm saying now, and they'll be like, oh, I know Brian Keane. Like, and you know, and that's it. Once you can connect like that, I think it's that connection that makes all the difference.
Yeah, I love that. And I think for any aspiring content creator or anyone that's listening that has a message, because I think your story, Rebecca, very similar to mine. We were both teachers. You were physical education. I was a primary school teacher, but we're now working in industry and doing things that we love, trying to help and serve people in a positive way. And that's how it starts. It starts with that, putting out a message, but then marrying those raw and authenticness and genuineness and just being consistent with that. So I think that's really helpful.
You know what the other thing is, right? You're also a single parent. I'm a single parent, okay? And I think that makes you really be efficient with your time as well. And like, you know, as well, in terms of like, because there's a little bit more pressure on you to grow your business and mind your children, that you need to do things really efficiently. And I think that's important as well, because you're giving that message to people like, I'm under time pressure here, but I'm able to do it. So I think that gives a bit of encouragement.
Oh, I love that. And that's so true, because one of my mentors used to always tell me that you can find an excuse, you can find a way. And children are the best excuse in terms of not getting stuff done, whether that's working out, preparing meals. And I get it. I'm 100% that some people have more time than others, but there's always going to be tools, tips, techniques and tricks that you can apply that are going to support you and help you, whether that's, you know, batching for meal prep or short high intensity workouts. I know that you favor them. I favor them as well. Outside of endurance prep for runs, I favor those high intensity workouts. And there's a way around all of these things and these obstacles. And I love that you put that out. I don't put my daughter or my family on social. I know you do, which is great. It makes it really connecting. Like I was literally like, if I could have doubled or treble liked the photo with the two girls that I saw on Instagram from a while back.
I totally know where you're coming from though. I really actually at the beginning was like, I'm not going to put them on at all. But then they're always with me. So it was so hard not to, because I only work kind of, would say 10 to 2 every day. So they're literally with me all the time. So I was actually finding it hard to not put them in the pictures. But yeah, it's hard. Double-edged sword.
And it's not a right or a wrong. Like it's very much a case, because my daughter, she's 8 now, and she's always asking to be on. She's 8 now, and she's always asking to go on my videos and be on TikTok. Not so much Instagram. She doesn't even know I have an Instagram account, which is hilarious. Like, yeah, that's it. She's like, TikTok, let's make a TikTok, Dad. And I'm like, they're all in private. If you go onto my TikTok, they're all in private videos, the ones we've made, the two of us, so she can just watch back on them herself. So I feel like I've pushed it this far. At some point she's going to want to come on, so I'll rubber stamp her. I've done well so far. I've done okay so far, you know. But again, that's the choice I made, and it's not a right or a wrong thing. It's just that, like, I had a very weird experience, Rebecca, when Holly was about 2, when I used to put her up on my Snapchat, and my mum got stopped in town from somebody recognizing Holly and wanting a photo with Holly because of Snapchat. And that was just the high end of weirdness. I was like, okay, that's it. She's coming down off my social. And most people, 99.9% of people are really respectful. They're lovely. Similar to you, I've got an amazing audience, but that was just one kind of weird moment that I'm like, okay, there's potential downsides to this. I'm going to minimize putting her on social, and then I just removed her completely, and I haven't put her up in nearly 6 years. And yeah, it's just, again, a choice just to give context for people. We've gone way off, Rebecca, but way off.
way off, but
Yeah.
it's important. It's important. Yeah, it is. It's so important. And like that, like I'd easily kind of completely remove them from it. It's something there was a reason to, right? But so far, like the audience is just so sound. Like everyone is just so sound. There's such good, positive people that are just really looking to improve their health. Like your audience, very similar. They just genuinely want to improve their health. So yeah, I think it's different if you're coming from a viewpoint of like your message is different, then you might have a different response.
Yeah.
So
yeah, 100%. Becca,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time. As I mentioned, I really appreciate it, and I plugged the Instagram here because you have so much valuable content for people. Also, the Rebalance program, I'll put that link in the description for people. The 12-week program for anyone that wants to work with you and they want to get that kind of in-depth working on hormone balancing strategies and getting that permanent weight loss. But if there's any other links or anywhere else you want to send people, Becca, please give us those links now.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that's really it. It's the link in my Instagram bio for the Rebalance program and just getting your application in. But that's it really. I have a new recipe ebook coming now in the next few weeks as well. So excited about that.
Amazing. And I will link the website as well, healthwithholland.com, below all the things we've talked about, the Instagram page, the ebook, and if that's ready before it comes out, I'll also link that for people.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks so much, Brian.
Becca, keep doing what you're doing. Really enjoyed this conversation, and I'll catch you soon.
Go on, chat soon.
There you have it, health coach Rebecca Holland on hormone balancing strategies that help women lose weight permanently and how cortisol can ruin your progress. Hopefully you enjoyed today's podcast and got loads from it. If you did and you haven't left a rating and a review, please do that at the end of the podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast. It helps massive with the reach, and I read all the reviews that I can, so it gives nice feedback on who you'd like to have on the podcast, what episodes you're connecting with, etc. So that's everything from me from today's podcast, and that's my ask from me. I'll catch you all next Monday.